praise Abba. We thank thee, Father, for one more day, one more blessing, one more breath. We thank thee for bringing us together, for allowing us to discuss thy word, to discover thy treasures, to be led by thee, and to prosper, Father, under thy countenance. We praise thee and we thank thee. His SheM Yahusha. Amen.
Amen. February 18th, for the record, on the calendar, Gregorian calendar. So what we're doing here with this series is going through this chart of, I might even call this one a poster of the names, done back in 2011. The last couple weeks we bumped into some matters in Jeremiah 31 having to do with some of the things right down in here about the establishing from the beginning what's going to happen in the future, Aleph Tav. The voice, Nun, Aleph, Mem, Nam, typically in scripture where he says, so says, or so declares, or thus saith, it's Nun, Aleph, Mem, Yahweh. Sometimes it's Nam Adonai, Yahweh. You can say, well, Adonai, that's translated Lord, but Yahweh is typically translated Lord. So it's thus saith Lord, Lord. But Adonai, Aleph, Dalet, Vav, Nun, Yod. Adon, Yod is the suffix that means mine or myself. Aleph is the prefix that means I will. So it's also speaking first person. And then you get Dalet, Vav, Nun, Don. Like Don Juan, or Don is in Spanish, in Spain, it's a title of you might say a patron, a boss man, a highly regarded elder, Don. What does that got to do with Hebrew? Well, Spain used to be called the Iberian Peninsula. The word Eber is where the word Hebrew comes from. It means to cross over. So if you were on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, you crossed over the Mediterranean Sea to the western shores, that would be Spain, the Spanish Peninsula. So the people that lived in Spain, Stephen Collins did some research on this, as well as Joseph Dumond, Yair Davidi, and a few other people. But Israelites, when the Northern Kingdom, 721 BC, when they were taken over by Assyria captured and killed quite a few, but then a bunch of them jumped ship and ran. A bunch of them landed on the north coast of Africa and built up with a huge influx of population all of a sudden, a place called Carthage, which is now what would be referred to as Libya. But apparently the word, what we call Carthage, see, the Carthaginians were conflicted with Rome some years later. So they had what they called the Punic Wars, Punic. Well, where do you get that word? If you take out the vowels, you get PNC. We would pronounce it as punk. Why were there was 3 Punic Wars. Rome finally prevailed and bashed Carthage down, destroyed Carthage. But Carthage was, remember, the ones who had sent Hannibal on these huge, what they called trireme ships, where they had 3 levels of oars and probably a few thousand guys at the oar, slaves, dragging this. And they had, Hannibal had invaded through the Alps with elephants. Carthage was a powerhouse militarily and economically, and basically controlled the Mediterranean. But Carthage came from a Hebrew word, I think it's Kufresh Tav, Kufresh Yod Tav, would be the word, one of the words for city, and then Chadesh, Chet Dalet Shin, like Rosh Chadesh, meaning new or renewed. So it's new city, or the renewing of the city. So I think it was Stephen Collins was talking about this, where when the Israelites journeyed from the land of Israel westward, Carthage was a good place to dock, to stop, to refresh supplies. And then they would head on out to Spain, the Iberian Peninsula. And they had quite a colony there in the days of Solomon. And then from Spain, they could go up to England, British, man of the covenant. Brit is the word covenant. And then from England, they would actually cut across to what we would call the New World, the Americas. And even the word Brazil is a Hebrew word, bet resh zayin lamed, meaning iron. Well, iron happens to be a chief export even today from Brazil. So the idea is, why would somebody name that place a Hebrew word unless they were Hebrew speakers? So, and even Peru on the other side of the tip of the continent there, Peru is the Hebrew word meaning to be fruitful. Peru uravu, the command to Adam to be fruitful and multiply. So the idea that the Israelites had gone all around the world, particularly with Solomon. And remember, you go back to it's either Chronicles, I think, maybe. Anyway, where Solomon was a young, he was pretty young. Was he a teenager maybe at the time when he was appointed king by David? David was on his last breath, and one of David's other sons had appointed himself to be king. And they're having a big party, a feast celebration for him. And somebody told Bathsheba, saying, hey, you better go tell David right now that they've just anointed this one son to be the king over Israel. Didn't you say that Solomon should be king? It's like, oh man. So Bathsheba went in and appealed to David, and he said, okay. So then they called in the prophet, anointed Solomon king. And then all the military officers who had been with that other guy all of a sudden go, uh-oh, we're in big trouble. Now there's this almost like this civil war set up. And so they all took off from that feast and came and had to swear allegiance to Solomon. And then, things happened as David died, and Solomon took over and had to eliminate the adversaries. But that era was approximately, let's just call it 1000 BC. Now, it was probably closer to 800 or 850 BC. David and Solomon were right around there. But just for big blocks of time, if we say Abraham was about 2000 BC, Moses about 1500, David about 1000, David and Solomon, and then the days of Daniel about 500, and then Yeshua was 0 between BC and AD, or BCE and CE, Common Era, before the Common Era. They changed those words a few years ago, just to give 500-year increments of time, just so people have this reference. And Abraham himself, being about 2000 BC, actually was, let's say, pretty close to 500 years after the flood. So the flood was about 2500 BC. So if we were going to say, like a few years ago, somebody was saying, let's make America great again. Hey, that's a great idea. When was America at its greatest, or even great at all? And you go, well, now some people, I've heard it said that the generation that were young men in their 20s, say, who went to fight in World War II, that was the greatest generation. They sacrificed hundreds of thousands of their millions of their own well-being to save somebody else, some other problem on the other side of the ocean. And then they came back and they developed what we might call the modern era, which is to say, instead of living on farms or working in factories, we have now the suburbia. We got television, and we have this common culture, and economics took over. And you might say the concept of democracy. Now, democracy was established way back with the Greeks, and that was about 500 BC. The Romans wasn't democracy. Well, the Roman Empire kind of took over the Greek Empire, and there's something called a fascia, F-A-S-C-H-I-A. Well, that's kind of where you get the word face, but it's a bundle of sticks, you know, however big. If you look on the US dime, an older dime has Roosevelt's face on one side, and the back side there's a couple fascia there. There's an axe head sticking out, and you might say it's just symbolism. Well, it's symbolism of a fascist republic. Republic means ruled by law. Democracy, as a big concept, means the voice of the people. Well, then the question is, well, is it the voice of the majority of the people? Here in Portland, Oregon, a couple years ago, they decided to put in a new bridge. Portland is known as Bridge City. There's probably 6 or 8 bridges crossing the Willamette River, a couple crossing the Columbia River. And so Portland is a city basically divided by this pretty big river. And so you got the east side and the west side. So they're putting in a new bridge, and they said, okay, we're going to, instead of having the city council just vote and give it a name, or give it the name of the biggest donor for philanthropic investments of reputation or whatever it might have been, hey, let's put it to the vote of the people. Well, I think what happened is that the young people got it in their mind, hey, how does this democracy thing work? It's the number of voices that sway. It's not logic. It's not reason. It's not truth. It's not the best idea. It's the most people. So amongst the younger generation, they all got this, you might say, this grassroots campaign going to name the bridge. And they had so many people that they won the election. And so the bridge is now named, I think it's Bridgie McBridge Bridge. What? Bridgie McBridge? What a stupid, hey, it's democracy. It's the voice of the people. They were trying to do something so stupid. Bridgie McBridge Bridge. Now we have to wear that till somebody else overrides the voice of the people and changes it to be a respectable name like George Washington Bridge or something like that. And then you do some research and you find out that George Washington was quite a scoundrel, quite a devious man, quite short of heroic, other than if you only look at one little microcosmic event in his life, perhaps. Anyway, it's like, what does great mean? Let's make America great again. Is that to say just like after World War II in the 1940s, 1950s? Well, then you start doing some research, and what were the tactics? What were the reasons that America as a corporate nation did certain things, and what did they do? And you realize, well, it's biblical. Yahweh says of Ephraim, especially, he says, Ephraim does things habitually which are lying, stealing, and killing, idolatry, going after other gods, which infuriates Yahuwah. Yeah, that's what we do. That's what America has done pretty consistently throughout the whole history that I can see. And it's like, what the heck is, when was America ever great? When they lied about what they were doing so that nobody knew? Was that their greatness? When they stole lands and lives from other people? Was that when they were the greatest? When they bamboozled with, you might call, false flag events? It's one of those things you can look up if you don't know what that is. What does it mean to be great? You know, I can't personally determine when America was ever great. So I can't go ahead with this, make America great again. If somebody were to say, let's make America great, to say, oh, that's a good idea. How would you do that? How would you make America great? Well, then when we read the scripture, especially like in Ezekiel and places where it's talking about the future, which we're going to get to here right quick, I'm talking about this line down here in the red that says, Jerusalem Bindar dun da'at. Bindar dun da'at. Jerusalem. I'm kind of talking about that. When we did last week, Hodu la yua ki tov, ki leolam chazdo, is a matter of giving thanks. Giving, the word hod, give thanks, give praise, confession of sin, which means you have to acknowledge the truth of what's going on, but then reverberating, echoing, resonating, projecting into the cosmos from the source of oneself, this heart of obedient worship. See, the word Obed, Ayin Bet Dalet, is both obedience, Obed, like Obadiah, worshiper. It means to worship and it means to serve, to obey, to work diligently. The word Shemesh, Shin Mem Shin, also means a diligent servant. It's a word for the sun, because the picture is the sun gets up every morning and runs across the sky as appointed, drops down and has to scurry on back to the other side and then jump up the next morning, and it does it every day for thousands, maybe millions of years. But the sun is a responsible servant doing what it was instructed to do. That's why it's called Shemesh. That's the word Obed. That's the same as the word worship. So if one were to say, how does one worship Elohim? If the word is Obed, one could say, how does one serve? Or how does one obediently do what Elohim has commissioned or requested or demanded that one do? So if Israel is Yahuwah's servant, Israel better do what what Yahweh has placed him as one who's supposed to do this. If you're the servant who's the painter, you're supposed to paint. If you're the servant who's the landscaper, you tend the yard. If you're the servant who's the concrete guy and you're supposed to pour a sidewalk, then that's what you're doing. And you do it. And if you don't do it, you're in trouble for not doing it. The word pay kuf dalet, pay is the P and the PH, which sounds like an F. So PQD or FQD, fakad, means to visit. And he says he's going to visit the iniquity. But pekuf dalet also means to pass in review. So when you have the parable of the wealthier man who was going on a journey and he called in his Obeds, his servants, and he says, I'm going to give you 5 talents and you 3 talents and you 1 talent, and you're supposed to make use of these, whether the talents were money value or opportunity or jurisdictional, whatever it was referred to as talents. Talent was a weight of currency, how many ounces or grams that silver or gold or something. But anyway, it could have been like talents, like what are your skills? Can you sing? Can you do gymnastics? You know, those are talents. But what I'm saying is that when that wealthier man left and he came back and he says, okay, he called them in and says, what have you done? That's the word pekuf dalet. So in the book of Job, where there's a picture in the beginning where Elohim is in his throne room and all the Melakim, the angels, the word Melach means one who is sent on a mission. We in English call it angel, but it's actually one sent on a mission. In other words, those two are put to task, and then periodically they're recalled back to the throne room and they're told to give account for what that was been accomplished according to the task that was commissioned to them. That's the word pekuf dalet. So for us to think, hey, well, all we got to do is believe and we don't have to do anything, that's a different That's a different theology, which you can believe anything you want. You're welcome to make up your own stories even if you want to and believe them. But when we see certain parables like the wealthy man giving talents to the three and they have to give account, or we see the story in the book of Job, which is people believe to be the very oldest book in the Bible, is the book of Job. So since the very beginning, there's this idea of Elohim doesn't run just, hey, I made everybody has a free-for-all party, do whatever you want. But there's responsibilities handed to individuals for which those individuals are very particularly responsible to give account for how it's going. And there's none of the stories about the book of Job where the angels say, boy, I'm having a hard time doing this and that. And he says, well, you're going to get in trouble or I'm going to diminish your regard. Remember, like he did with the three men, one invested 5 and earned 5 more. He says, well done. One invested 3, got 3 more. Well done. And the guy says, hey, the guy you gave a single one to, he says, I know you're a tough guy and you reap where you haven't sown. And so I didn't want to lose this. So I buried it. And here, I've given it back to you. And he says, you worthless slave, you worthless, good for nothing. He starts giving him bad vibes. He's not making him feel good about himself. Why not? I thought our Elohim is gentle Jesus, meek and mild, who builds up people's frail egos and clarifies their misunderstanding. And why would he then tell this story about this wealthy man who berates, criticizes, condemns, makes him feel bad about himself? He didn't lose the money. I mean, come on. So we have to sit here and look at this and go, hello, what am I supposed to learn here? What does he want me to think and consider? Which is why he's telling me this story. What does he want us to do with this? Well, the idea that on the one hand, we can say, I love you, I praise your holy name, I worship you. Well, that's an expression of the heart, or an expression of the intellect. And only the individual person can determine whether it's heartfelt or intellect. And if somebody says, listen, our God's got a bit of a frail ego. He always has to be told how great he is. Just patronize him a little bit. What? You're going to patronize your God? Keep it. Don't let him hear you. Just tell him, oh, you're wonderful. You're majestic. Oh, yes, you're glorious. Why does he keep after hearing that? I mean, why does, come on, tell me how good I am. It's like, should I even be talking like this? It's like if you go to a worship service and it's like, okay, we're going to tell God how wonderful he is and how beautiful he is, though we can't see him. And though what we see, then you get realistic people. They say, are you kidding me? Look at all the stuff going on in the face of Earth, the horrible things that animals do to each other, that nature does, that people do to each other. If there's a powerful God, why doesn't he stop it? Why doesn't he change it? Why doesn't? And then so you get believers who say, well, no, we have to have free will. And so they rationalize his apparent lack of intervention. And sometimes, then you get other cultures who are a little bit more free, showing horrible faces with some deity figure, and they're throwing lightning bolts down and they're doing this and doing that. And it's like, oh, that's not our God. And it's like, well, unless you read the Old Testament. And it's like, wait a minute. That's right. I've had people say, don't tell me the stories of the Old Testament. I don't like that God. This one friend of mine was saying, I want to believe that my God is a loving and pure and good, holy, the sacred loving heart, radiating love and forgiveness, patience, mercy, warmth. Pick all your list of adjectives. And then you read about the God in the Old Testament, and it's like the opposite or quite contrary. Don't even tell me that, because I gotta hold on to my image of this deity that I want to love, that I choose to love. I only want to hear those words. And if you tell me that, it might disturb me. It might agitate me within, and I don't know what to do with that. I might start getting an attitude of, why are you dirty rat? I mean, and if we start having bad attitudes about our God, he's liable to throw lightning bolts at us. And then, life's tough enough. Even when you're nice, you're good. Don't hurt me. I mean, this is just the reality of what I've seen through my life, that this is what's going on, really. And so the question is, gosh, how do you play this game? How do you make him feel good about himself so that he can make our life good enough, comfortable enough, that we don't cause any unnecessary ripples of agitation, so that we can ask for prayers of healing or for money to pay our bills, and he'll send it. Whew, thank you. But what if we got his character wrong somehow? If we misappropriate his character, is he going to get ticked off and start slapping us around and causing bad things to happen? So do we always have to say, listen, just always figure he's the greatest, the best, the most wonderful, and just keep talking about that? Is that the word hodu? Is the word hodu, give praise and thanks, is that what we're doing? See, there's this whole other concept. There's a concept that says he, the Almighty, Yahweh Zavot, the creator of heaven and earth and the sea and all that's contained within, that when he made Adam, he gave Adam a position in the universe somewhat like an Elohim, to actually say things and project things from the heart that causes ripples to go forth and make things happen, to actually change the resonance, the vibration, the frequency, whatever you want to call it, that Adam is a source of change. How? Well, if he has a certain idea that he takes to heart and then speaks with his mouth or behaves in accordance, in the three, if you have voice and behavior, that's four. When they're all echad, one, then it's an impacting force. If you look at other religions and New Age philosophies, they all talk about this as a secret of woo-woo or mojo or vibe, or however you want to call it. But essentially, see, that's another way of iterating the Mishkan pattern, in the sense that here's this big white fence, and according to the theory of it being round and not being white, but that's a different matter. But just for the sake of consistency of the notion of the Mishkan pattern, there's this white linen, but if the linen's been dyed red, blue, and purple, then it's no longer white. But the idea of white linen as a fence surrounding a compound, and in the compound is the barbecue grill, the laver, and then in the covered tent area, you've got the menorah, the table of showbread, the altar of incense, and then there's a veil, and on the other side of the veil, there's the Ark of the Covenant in the what's called the Kadosh Kodashim, or the most holy place. So the holy place, or the Kadosh place, is the tented area. There's three things in there. The menorah, you step in the way I've pictured it from the words that were given in Exodus 25. You got the menorah on the left, and then you've got the table of showbread on the right. Then right in front of you is the altar of incense, and then there's this veil, and inside the veil is the Ark of the Covenant. And inside the Ark of the Covenant was Aaron's rod that budded, and a bowl with the manna that had appeared for 40 years and then stopped showing up once they got into the promised land. And then you've got the tables of stone. Remember, Moses broke the first set, and he was told to carve out 2 tables of stone, and then Yahweh went and wrote with his finger, and those are placed inside the Ark of the Covenant. And those should be still in there. I'm saying all that for a reason. We're going to get to it probably in the second hour. Critical consideration. That's in Exodus 25. He starts talking about how to make the menorah. But anyway, so if this big white fence with at least the gate, if not all the fabric all the way around, had the embroidery of blue, purple, and red woven wool, I believe it was, with gold threads, blue, purple, red, white linen with the gold threads. That's the embroidery on the high priest and also all over the gate, at least, of the big Mishkan fence, and then whatever's going on inside with the curtains and veils and stuff. Those are the colors of Yahweh's schematic. But outside the fence then is this essence of the darkness. So just to appropriate the distinction between here's the fence, the kingdom of light, contrasted with the general wilderness, the darkness. The darkness, and then they build this Mishkan, which is this compound, fenced off area, pasture land, whatever you want to call it, of light. The darkness compared to light. So when Yahusha was crucified, they took him outside the walls of Jerusalem. So the concept, he is taken outside the camp, crucified in the darkness, in the face of the people who were in darkness and his adversaries. And from what I understand, what the Romans used to do is, we see pictures on a hill far away stood an old rugged cross. But what they did is they took the walkway, street level, sidewalk level, and they dug a hole and jammed that cross in there. So the guy hanging on the cross was right in your face. And they put a sign up of this is his criminal act. And it would maybe be right on the roadway walking into the market. So as you were going into the town and there's the gate to the city right there, you'd be walking right past this guy at face level in agony, bleeding and being tormented by the Roman crucifixion. It wasn't on some remote hill far away stood an old rugged cross. It was an instrument of severe torture. And if you don't do what we say, if you don't obey our law, us Romans, see, the Roman symbol of their republican law was these 2 fascia, like what's on the American dime, like if you look at the American Senate, you'll see these 2 bundles of these sticks with the axe head on either side of the staging of the Senate. That means rule by law. And if you don't obey a law, you get the crucifixion. And they're going to do it right in your face so that you always have it right there. And it's like, gosh. How am I tying all this together? When was the heyday, the glory days, the golden age of Israel? When was America ever great? When was Israel great? Well, Israel was great. Well, got to be the days of Abraham. Only there was no Israel at the days of Abraham. See, the guy named Abraham had 2 sons, Isaac and Ishmael, and then he had 6 more sons later with Keturah. And then one of the sons, Isaac, had 2 sons, Jacob and Esau, and then they each had 12 sons, but Jacob had his name changed to Israel. So that was Abraham's grandson was named Israel. And one of Israel's sons was named Yahudah, like the word Hodu, which is where you get the word Jew. So Abraham wasn't a Jew. Neither was Isaac, nor was Jacob. Nor were the other 11 sons of Jacob. None of them were Jews. Yahudah, you could say he was a Jew, but then the word Jew, what does that even mean? So you get this idea Well, there's this thing called rabbinical Judaism, and if you acknowledge, if you yield to the authority, the doctrinal rulings, laws of the rabbis, then you're a Jew. Well, there's also half a dozen other meanings of the word Jew, just so you know. If your mother was a Jew, then you're a Jew. Or if you're of the land of Israel, you're a Jew. You could say that. Or even if you're a Palestinian, you could say, well, what makes you a Jew? Culturally, you can be a Jew. Remember we said, the chief rabbinate guy in London was saying it's the language which makes you a Jew. So it ties the Jews together. So there's this Jew thing about speaking Hebrew or keeping the Jewish holidays, Leviticus 23, or keeping the Sabbath day. Did you know? Now, somebody could say, shut up, this guy's an idiot, doesn't know what he's talking about. I've read some things, and I've read that the Jews or certain rabbis have a law on their books that even still prevails today that says anybody who's not a Jew who tries to or intends to keep the Sabbath day can be legally killed, put to death. If you're not a Jew and you say, hey, I'm going to keep the Sabbath day, that's a felony crime with a death sentence, according to the Jews. The Jews. It's like, what? Who, what Jews? You have to start nitpicking and finding out who has what authority to make what declaration. But I'm just saying that the law, like in the American Senate, those two fascia, we rule by law, not by democratic voice. The law of the Jews is anybody who's not a Jew that tries to keep or intends to keep the Sabbath day or the Moedim should be put to death, just so you know. From what I understand, the Islamic law is that if you talk smack about Muhammad, their chief prophet, you can be and should be put to death, and that wouldn't be a crime. So you don't say stupid things, about their prophet. Just like anybody you might say who says, oh, Moses, and you make fun of his name and you tell stupid jokes about him, like, bimbo jokes about Moses or the Jews, that's a crime. It's like if I said anything bad about George Washington, that might be a crime to some patriotic blue blood American. Red blood, wait a minute. The blue bloods they're not even human. They're special. They're half lizard. The blue blood royalty, the Merovingian order, those who rule the monarchies of Europe, don't regard themselves as human. Did you know that? That's why they're called the royals, the blue bloods. And they can, apparently, I've heard this a few times, that you could take every American president and trace their lineage back to King John of England. Really? What is it? We got 46 presidents now, and they can all trace their lineage. Their genealogy all goes back to one certain king. How'd that happen? Stuff goes on behind the scenes we don't know about. The point is, who makes up the laws? Who makes up the laws? If American presidents are not necessarily voted into office because of the democratic voice of the people, majority rules, hey, we got this guy as a boss. But see, the United States of America was turned into a corporation in 1871, from what I understand. After the Civil War, the place called the United States, or the various states, now we have 50 states, the 50 states united together as a nation. That's a concept, and there's a constitution. But to say that the corporation called the United States of America is a corporation, and it has a constitution, which is similar but different than the other constitution, and that's what took over and is running things. So the United States of America, as we might think, doesn't exist. It exists as a concept and it exists in some people's hearts, but it doesn't exist as a rule of law. There is no law of that entity. The corporate law is what works. But it's like, wait a minute, how do corporations have laws? Well, they do on international courts. Corporations can rule with laws. For example, this thing called the WHO, the WHO just passed some kind of a law that says that if there's ever anywhere in the world some sort of event that puts humans at risk in terms of their health, they get to call the shots and supersede all national sovereignties by making up the rules as to how it's going to happen. That was apparently just passed recently, last week or two. Really, so a corporate with no voted in officials, a corporation run by certain people who just decided to do it, say we get to rule the world and we get to tell every nation what to do with the authority of military backing, or else people are in big trouble, meaning they get to be imprisoned or killed because we say so. And all the nations go, okay. Say, what? Hey, I don't have to understand it or like it. That's just what it is. You can say, but that's a rule of law. They are making up their own law. Well, why should the United States go along with that? Because the United States is not the nation, it's the corporation that gets its power from other corporations. Like, so there's a certain flag with 3 stars. What does that mean? I think it's a white flag with a couple red bars and 3 stars. That's Washington, D.C., District of Columbia. That's City of London, and that's the Vatican City. These 3 cities together is like a triumvirate of power. The city of the Vatican City of Rome isn't part of Rome, isn't part of Italy. The City of London isn't part of London, isn't part of Britain, and Washington District of Columbia is not part of the United States. They're separate power, and they rule things. Well, where do they get their power? They make up their own laws, and then they enforce them using other people's military and economics. Yeah, but I heard on the there was somebody talking on the radio. There was a pastor was giving this speech just recently, a sermon, and he said, the title of this speech is The Top 3 Indicators That You've Gone Back Under the Law. The top 3 indicators that you have gone back under the law. As if that was a dastardly thing. Whose law? The law of Washington, D.C. or Rome or London? The law of some empire? The law of some shadowy authority that you don't even know is giving you laws? Or is he trying to say that you've gone back under the law of some tyrannical beast, monster god of the Old Testament? When was Israel ever great? Wasn't it the days of David? And just as David got out from underneath Saul, the first king, David was king number 2, Solomon was king number 3. So Saul had his heart far from Yahweh, even though he was speaking prophetic words as one of the prophets, remember, before he got anointed to be the king, and then his heart turned away. David's heart was with Yahweh and was known as the friend of Yahweh. He handed the kingdom to Solomon, and Solomon, as a young man, started off great, and then he had all these 1,000 wives and concubines that, let's just say, he had them for the sake of cultural diplomacy. You give me your daughter, I'll give you my daughter, and then we'll be friends, and it's like, now what do? I don't even have time to talk to her, much less tend her needs, and I'll let her build her temple to her culture, and that'll keep her distracted, and I got things to do. That's if Solomon's thinking that. So he ended up with, let's say, hundreds of temples to Elohim Achrim, foreign deities, and it says that's just eroded Israel. So the only heyday, the pinnacle, would be later part of David's life, the beginning of Solomon's life. That would have been the golden era. And how many years? 20, 30 years, maybe? And if we look back, it says, well, that's when Israel was great. Well, it was great because David had a heart for the law, not just the Torah, the instructions. Read Psalm 119, all about, how I love these instructions. But the word law is actually chet kuf, chok. To walk in the chok of law of Yahweh's, this is what it is. If you stick a vav in between chet and kuf, you get chok instead of chak, and that means a rung on a ladder, a rung on a ladder. This is how you climb. This is how you ascend. This is how you prevail. This is how you get altitude. Well, the word to go up high in success and promotion is ayin lamed, or ayin lamed yod hey, aliyah. To go back to the land is to make aliyah. To go back to the Torah is to make aliyah. For Ephraim, to come back to the Torah is to make aliyah, to rise up. For the prodigal son to say, why am I sitting here wishing I could eat the food of these pigs? Why don't I go back home? Because the word azir was chet zayin yod resh, is the word pig, means one who returns. So in Hebrew, the prodigal son, I wish I could eat the food of one who returns. Hey, why don't I go back to my father's house and eat the food of one who returns? That's why we're going back to these words in this Torah, is to eat the food of one who returns to the Father's heart. And because the Father expressed to his son Israel his laws of the universe are like H2O. 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 atom of oxygen under a certain stress will produce a molecule of water. That's a law. Because he said, as we were reading in Jeremiah, I think it was last week, we mentioned it, Yahuwah, who, now he's going to give himself a description, who set the laws of the sun so that it jumps up, runs across the sky, sits, comes back, sets up, and gives us the seasons, and the moon is sitting there with certain phases, and it shows up, but it, Yod Resh Chet, Yerach is the moon, word for moon, it means wanderer, and so you get the word Resh Chet. Yod is a prefix, it will, well, Resh Vav Chet is Ruach, and that means expanse, means mind, disposition, the will, that means the attitude. But Resh Yod Het, Rich is where we get the word for fragrance. So the fragrance drifting on a breeze and expanding and going. So why is that the word for the moon? The moon is also called the white one, so Lamed Bet Noon. It's also called Rosh Chodesh. Well, that's not the word moon or month. That just means the head, the new head, or the fullness, different ways to read that. But the word moon itself is basically the one that wanders or drifts like a fragrance on the wind. But he who established the laws of the sun, the laws of what makes the moon do what it does, even though it's all over the place, we're trying to figure out what the heck kind of laws are those. So some which are very orderly, some which are meandering, you might say. And the one who made the laws of the sea. What are the laws of water? Under no agitation, it's perfectly still. The slightest provocation, it'll show ripples. The whole cymatic, C-Y-M-A-T-I-C, cymatic study is about how water or sand, picks up ripples of vibration. The slightest, why does it do that? Because he made it do that. Well, see, those are laws. And if I sit here and say, the laws of my Elohim, he made certain things work. If we do certain things, we get blessed. And if we do opposite or contrary to those things, we get cursed. And those are laws. And then somebody says, yeah, you're going back under the law. It's like, you bet. We were told that if we regard Sunday, we'll get blessed. If we regard Sunday as the holy day, or back when I was a kid, don't work on Sunday. All that's, let's just call it borscht. It's not true. You see, the Sabbath day, the seventh day, was made the law. And when Elohim made the universe on 6 days, on the seventh day he rested, he thus declared it to be kadosh. It's been kadosh before there was any other people with governments or traditions or cultures or laws. It had nothing to do with other people. He made Yom HaShabbat, Yom HaShavua, the seventh day, kadosh. And so when some people say it was the Catholic Church, but it might have been the Orthodox Church, because the Catholics didn't come out until like 1,500 years later. And it was at least by the Council of Nicaea in 321, maybe it was 325, somewhere around then, of the Common Era, that they said, by our authority, by our human voice of authority, we're changing the sacred day from the 7th to the 1st, just to prove that we can. And, they told Martin Luther that's the same authority that they changed the Sabbath day 1,000 years before Martin Luther. By that same authority, they're telling him to recant. It doesn't have to be written in Scripture. It's by the voice of their authority. That's their law. So whoever's telling us now, oh, you're going back under the law, they're running the show with law. Are you kidding? They're speaking with a forked tongue, just so you know. So Elohim speaks to Israel, his people, and says, I who made all the laws of the universe included laws of how humans will find life and success, prosperity, to be raised up to a higher dignity. And it's this: listen to my voice, Shema, Shema Koli, listen to my voice. Guard and do what I said, Shamar, guard, keep, watch, observe, strain out the dregs, keep it pure and clean. And then Ayin Shin Hey, be about the business of doing as an Obed, a dutiful servant, which is your worship to me. So Yahuwah has established by his voice in covenant with Israel. And then when we look back at Jeremiah 31, it was the house of Israel and the house of Yehuda, two houses. So some people don't like that. That's what he said. And he said, if you Shema, Shomer, and Ayin Shin Hey, Oseh or Asha, however you want to pronounce that, Asha, to do, to cause, to push, to force, to accomplish what I said. So that's why we're talking about these things, because it's a push to make real, to make an issue out of what he said. And he said, if you do those things, Israel, it'll go well with you. You'll find life. You will succeed. Your enemies will be pushed down, kept at bay. Now, why? If Israel sits here and says, I'm going to sit down on the seventh day, and all of a sudden Israel's enemies are pushed down, because there's this, what you might say, a quantum entanglement between what Yahweh told Israel to do in the visible and the invisible ramifications or effect that it has on the universe surrounding Israel. And yet, I was told, I learned through culture, through history, through reading the Bible in English, through going to school, church, and things talked about, Bible studies, books, songs, that it's all been changed, that that's not true, that that's an old God for an old covenant, for an old people, an old religion, which is zeroed out, has no effect on anything anymore. And that's based on the book of Hebrews. And we're going to look at that. There's a lot of stuff here to look at in the next hour, specifically stuff in Hebrews 7 and 8 and 9 and 10, compared to Jeremiah 31, because Jeremiah 31 says, verse 32, this is the covenant that I will make after those days with the house of Israel. I'm going to write it. I'm going to write my covenant on their heart. I'm going to place it in their mind. They will be my people. I will be their Elohim. Now, the book of Hebrews quotes that. Hebrews chapter 8 and Hebrews chapter 10. We're going to look at that. It's quoting directly from Jeremiah, but not so directly. But it's a direct quote. But it spins it differently. And I'll address that. But the point is, what's that got to do with this chart? Jerusalem. Well, that's the city. That's the city where he put his name. But the word Rosh, Resh Vav Shin, means to inherit. It also means poison. It means to be kicked out, to disinherit. Why would the word for inheritance also be poison? The one story goes to my mind of the woman accused of adultery by her husband. He was supposed to take her to the priest, and the priest picks up some dust from the, you might say, the Mishkan or the temple floor, mixes it with some water, and has her drink it. Now, if she was truly unfaithful, it said her belly would extend and her thigh would rot. What does that mean? That means her internal self putrefies, rots, turns gangrene. She decays from the inside out. And apparently it would happen pretty darn quick. It's like if she was guilty of that adultery, and if she wasn't guilty, well, she'd drink the thing and nothing would happen. So, and then her husband would say, shame on you for thinking ill of her, for making bad assumptions, misrepresenting her integrity. Knock it off, you jerk. Go back home and be nice to each other. Okay. Well, see, this is like Israel and Yahuwah. What's Yahuwah's complaint about his people? It was always the same complaint, which we're going to look at real quick. I'm going to try to go through pretty fast some of these things in the next hour. His complaint against Israel is that Israel, from the get-go, at the very beginning, he pulls them out of Egypt, and right there at Mount Sinai, they're worshiping the golden calf. He takes them into the promised land. Hey, I've got this thing all set up. It's the most spectacular land. I've got it all prepared to just take out the people and move you into their houses and their vineyards. And they accused him of being a criminal, brought us out here to kill us, and had to wander 40 years in the desert, in the wilderness, because they didn't want to go in. They wouldn't trust him. And then when he finally brings them in, they keep sucking in these the gods and deities of the nations from around, and they refused to zero in on him and his ways and his words, his laws. That's been the problem with Israel all along. David finally took it to heart, and Yahweh said, oh, finally. And then David figured out, as it were, how to open the portal of heaven and stick a broom handle in so it couldn't close, and so the blessing kept pouring out. How did he do that? When they got the Ark of the Covenant back, he put singers and musicians, and they would 24/7 be singing praises and playing music worship, kind of like the International House of Prayer, 24/7 doing worship. And the blessings kept pouring down as the praises kept going up, until they turned it into some kind of formula, and then the whole thing went kaputski, broken and fell apart. But when David had a true heart for doing that, it worked. When David had a true heart and did what Yahweh said, it worked. So if there's a golden era that we need to go back to, that's the model, that's the pinnacle. It has nothing to do with America, has nothing to do with Rome or London or the Western culture, Greco-Roman culture. It has to do with Israel. And not Israel when they got in trouble for not doing what Yahweh said. So Assyria took over, and then they ran to Carthage and fought against Rome, and then they ran to the Iberian Peninsula and became rabbinical Judaism. It has nothing to do with that Israel. It has to do with the Israel of David's heart expressed in Psalm 119. Anyway, with that, we have to take a break here and get into the next hour.